Financial exploitation, elder abuse, and neglect are tragically commonplace.
It's occurring in about 1 out of 10 older adults. At some point during their life, after the age of 65, are going to experience abuse.
Financial exploitation of older people is tragically commonplace.
How can you turn against the parent that had raised you all these years? To turn on that parent is unacceptable.
It's occurring in about 1 out of maybe 10 older adults. At some point during their life, after the age of 65, are going to experience abuse.
Financial exploitation, elder abuse, and neglect are tragically commonplace.
How can you turn against the parent that had raised you all these years? To turn on that parent is unacceptable.
It's occurring in about 1 out of maybe 10 older adults.
These are tragedies in almost any kind of family.
Don't be afraid to step in and help somebody. If it's an elderly person across the street, if it's calling in a concern that something just isn't right, don't be afraid to act. Do something, because it's happening more often than most people think.
About half of the people with dementia at some point will experience some type of abuse. The numbers are staggering.
Financial exploitation of older people is tragically commonplace.
How can you turn against the parent that had raised you all these years? To turn on that parent is unacceptable.
It's occurring in about 1 out of maybe 10 older adults. At some point during their life, after the age of 65, are going to experience abuse. And that's a lot of people. When we talk about people who have a dementia, such as Alzheimer's disease, that number goes up to about half of the people with dementia at some point will experience some type of abuse. The numbers are staggering.
Elder Victims, Abused, Exploited, Alone is a Minnesota Partnership co-production with the Minnesota Safe Elders Initiative and Twin Cities Public Television.
As we get older, we become more vulnerable to abuse and neglect for a variety of issues. Some of those issues are physical. You become more frail, you might need more help with things. Some of them might be cognitive, where you're having some memory loss and require some assistance with handling finances. And some of it is emotional and social, which is you really want to stay home, you want to stay independent, and people know how to prey upon a lot of those different vulnerabilities.
An abuse case is really over a period of time. It's a pattern of behavior, and so when you look at patterns of behavior, you of course have to investigate many, many things.
The largest portion of financial exploitation of older adults is perpetrated by family members, unfortunately. Family members and other people who are trusted. They may be pastors, they may be neighbors, they may be members of the same Elks Club.
I was a commander. I spent about 17 years on the SWAT team for Duluth. In the fall of 2002, I had received a phone call from my mother in regards to a conversation she believed that she had, but wasn't quite sure whether it was a dream. And she was obsessive about that dream and was calling continuously. She subsequently became worse mentally with phone calls, and it was apparent that she was in some type of mental distress over that short period of time. And then she had went to a physician in November of 2002 and was hospitalized and diagnosed with onset dementia.
One thing I've observed is that in the early stages of a dementia, such as Alzheimer's disease, when you sort of look good and you're physically still strong, This is when you tend to be quite vulnerable to financial abuse.
Before Lois was hospitalized, and for a short period of time after she was released from the hospital, Scott Campbell was named as her power of attorney, was also on as the joint account holder on both savings accounts and on checking accounts. When they were going through the normal discharge process of releasing her from the hospital, they had a family session with Tim Campbell and Scott Campbell, and that was key in the trial, that Tim Campbell, the defendant in the case, was there, where the doctor clearly articulated this as her diagnosis. It is my recommendation that she go into an assisted living facility. And everybody was in agreement that was the plan. Even at that time, my understanding was Lois even agreed with that plan. However, once she was released from the hospital and lived with Scott Campbell for a period of time, she removed Scott Campbell from the accounts and put Tim Campbell on, with the concern that somehow his handling her finances related to his ability to put her in this facility she didn't want to go into.
She spent 20 years of her life working in a nursing facility and had seen examples of what that type of life may be, and I'm sure that that was a difficult thing for her to recognize when she had those moments, if that's how she was going to be spending her life.
Tim Campbell gets on her checking account and her savings account, and that's when he buys the, what was it, $17,000, $18,000 vehicle.
I had learned in the spring of 2003 that a car had been purchased with her funds by my brother. She had spoke to my wife and I in regards to that, and was very concerned that he was into her cash accounts and had purchased this vehicle with her funds. At that point of conversation and talking with her, she forbid me to take any action in regards to it because of his position on the police department at the time. He was a police officer. He had a young family. She did not want to see him lose his job.
He sent his in-laws and another couple, 4 individuals, to Vegas to thank them for helping him build his house. He built a house. There were purchases at Walmart.
And I had given Tim a number of opportunities to try and explain to me where the monies went. Who authorized it? What did Mom tell you to do with it? Where did you get the approval? Who knows about it? Within 18 months, the $107,000 and change dollars was spent on personal use. It was just spent on frivolous things.
The Campbell case is one of those cases in which you look at the facts and say, how could that happen? Not only was the perpetrator a son, a family member, but someone who, by any estimation, should have been a law enforcer and not a law breaker.
It was a very tragic thing for her. She just couldn't understand how this could happen to her and why he would have done this to her. And it just took a heavy toll on her. And then she was diagnosed with myelodysplasia, which was a leukemia-based type of disease, along with the dementia, and subsequently passed in November 2004 in the nursing home. But the battle continued.
The Campbell trial, the first time, actually took 4 weeks to try. The jury took a number of days, and the judge ended up calling the jury back and asking them if they were able to make a decision. They said that they were at an impasse.
The jury came back as a hung jury, couldn't make the decision because of the technicalities of the law. The law was confusing to them.
The decision was made that the Attorney General's office would seek review of that opinion with the Minnesota Court of Appeals.
That first appeal by the state court was critical in the review of the state statutes and clarified significantly exactly the foundation behind the statute. The court recognizes that because you are a joint tenant on the account, you do not have carte blanche to remove the funds of the other party. That is just not a part of the fiduciary responsibility as joint tenants in the account.
Fiduciary means somebody is in a position of trust with another person. So, for example, a power of attorney, a trustee under a trust, a guardian or a conservator over a vulnerable adult. All of those create a fiduciary relationship. And Campbell clearly articulated that.
And then we had a trial, and the jury came back and convicted.
The value of the Campbell case, though, is that because of the ups and downs of the court decisions, the lessons that were learned through the excellent prosecution of that case were lessons we could apply in amending the law that defines criminal financial exploitation in Minnesota, so that some of the ambiguities that served to hang up the case in the first instance are now made much clearer in law, that we're not just talking about money, we're talking about property, real properties, things you own, whether it's a house or goods.
The issue was about trying to do justice and to make sure that she was protected, because the whole idea behind this decision was to make sure that she was well off in her end-of-life issues and living comfortably. She deserved to have that, and that was robbed from her. And it's unacceptable to have that in any family's scenario.
This is not a crime of money. This is a crime against a person. And when people equate it to a dollar sign as opposed to a person, it's just wrong. Somebody has been hurt. Somebody, whether they know it or not, and that's what makes it so wrong. When they don't know what's happening to them, how could somebody do that to them?
You need to act in regards to this, that this is not a quiet family thing that you just don't recognize. You need to take that approach to stop this elder abuse. With the amount of monies that are out there with these senior populations, they're all susceptible to this type of victimization, and that has to be stopped.
We need cooperation among families. We need cooperation by law enforcement. We need cooperation by people that are rendering services to these victims to make sure we can have a successful prosecution.
Physical abuse occurs when an elder is hit, sometimes burned, and shoving. Those are some of the forms of physical abuse. Having things thrown at them occurs as well. And this is when we'll see people who have bruising, broken bones. And one of the real tragedies about elder abuse is that many of the changes of aging that are either normal or common can mask or mimic signs of physical abuse in particular.
What we want to encourage law enforcement to do is work collaboratively with adult protective services, with county social services, because it is almost impossible to persuade a spouse in that situation to make a decision to make a report, even if these calls are repeated. But with social services, there is an opportunity, it's still a challenge, to create some trust so that the individual, little by little, is willing to get some help and to let strangers in to provide that protection for the victim.
June 20th was the time that he had started the violence. Before it was all verbal, and I didn't pay much attention to it, you know, because I figure husbands and wife squabble all the time. But then on June 20th, the neighbor had heard me scream, and he called the police. They came up the sidewalk, and Marv saw them coming up, and they said, "You say anything and I'll kill you." So I kept quiet. When the police officers came in the door, they said, "Mrs. Phil, how did you get your two black eyes?" I said, "Would you believe that the cat jumped off the head of the bed and landed on my face?" And they said, "No, we wouldn't believe it." And I said, "Oh, well, that's what happened." And then they said, "You know, we can arrest him right here. Will you please tell us the truth?" And I said, "I am." The lady cop gave me her number, and she said, "If you have any more problems, please call us, because we can protect you." Well, all I could hear was him threatening me and threatening my loved ones or relatives or neighbors and the neighbors' children. Then after that, it was July 18th. It seemed like around 6:30 in the evening, his whole disposition and personality changed. He said, "Will you please get out in the kitchen and start making supper?" And I said, "Yeah, in a few minutes," here and there. And of course, I was using a walker at the time, and then all of a sudden he he grabbed me around the neck, right up here, and squeezed, and I said, well, what did you do that for? And he said, I'm gonna finish you off. He picked up my walker and he slammed it against my leg. Well, this is the result now after all the treatment I've had. He kept hitting me and hitting me and hitting me. And then he took the walker and slammed it into my stomach. I said, that hurts. And he said, oh, does it hurt? Here, I'll do it again. All of a sudden, he tipped the walker over, and I fell flat on the floor. And then he started hitting me again and bashing my leg, just hitting and hitting and hitting. Then he said, get up and get over to the kitchen and start fixing supper. And I said, I can't get up. And then he hit me again, and then he said, well, I'll try to lift you up. And he tried to lift, and I couldn't stand, I couldn't do nothing. And then the neighbors heard me scream. He called the neighbor and he said, I can't get Darlene up, she won't stand. And he said, can you come over? Well, then after he hung up, then he hit me some more. And I didn't realize then how bad my leg looked. The neighbor knew something was wrong, and then he told Marv, will you call the medics and get them over here? And he knelt down by me and he told Marv, he says, don't tell me your wife, Darlene, fell. Oh yeah, she tripped over the cats and fell. And Marv went out, and I guess he stayed out on the porch with the one police officer, and the other one came in and he said, oh, well, he said, this is the worst case I have ever in my life seen. The medics came and they said, we better get her to the hospital, we're losing her. They put me up on the gurney and got me out, and the last thing I heard was, Mr. Sill, you're under arrest. Well, he made a bunch of remarks about, well, she deserved it and that, I was punishing her and all this bunch of baloney, you know. And I don't know what happened then, because I left and that was the last time I ever saw him. When he was in jail, the police said the best thing for me to do was get a restraining order on him, which I did. And if he got within 2 blocks of me, they'd arrest him all over again.
We were contacted by the nursing home staff who contacted us due to her situation, needing further help, needing further the counseling services and advocacy services for her.
These abusers will threaten the women until they're so scared senseless they don't know what to do.
I was able to contacting with the counselor and saying, Darlene needs to work on her PTSD. Can we just focus on this? So taking a small steps with her made a huge difference in the long run. 2 years of the counseling services, and she's still receiving the counseling services. So it is not a overnight deal that the victim is going to be done and heal with their situation overnight. It can take a lot longer.
Is anybody taking your money without your permission? Are you afraid of anybody? Is anybody hurting you? Those 3 simple questions, done in a calm, quiet, private way, would allow us to, I think, detect elder abuse at much earlier stages and do something to help people.
Unfortunately, law enforcement usually only learns of this after the pattern has existed for an extensive period of time. If family members or friends or anyone close to a victim of this kind of situation begins to notice it, they certainly should contact Adult Protective Services or social services to at least make them aware. And someone can go out and visit with them.
Cream Eric was a woman of means for her age. She had a pension. She had invested her money wisely over the years, she and her husband. She benefited from annuities and from a death benefit related to his passing. She had a great deal of income.
For a retired school teacher, she had a substantial amount of assets. It was up towards $1 million.
A man named Larry Fiskus was her nephew, and he moved into her home 5 years before she died. Almost immediately upon him entering her life, she stopped seeing friends. She wouldn't answer the phone. When he answered the phone, he would be rude to her friends and say she wasn't there when she was indeed in the house. And that began almost immediately, which is a characteristic of financial exploitation or maltreatment of a vulnerable adult, because if the person who would choose to do harm can keep interested parties away, then they can take greater advantage. By all accounts, she adored him. She loved this man who was her nephew, and that may very well have been the precursor which led him to come into the house.
When he initially moved in, he had her sign a power of attorney, giving him the ability to make her financial decisions. And then she developed dementia, and over the course of that next decade, her dementia just got progressively worse. And in 2007, he had her sign a much more detailed power of attorney document. And I showed that power of attorney document to her physician and asked, do you think that given her cognitive ability at the time she signed this, she would have understood what she was signing? And he took a look at it and he said, absolutely not.
From the point of time when he became power of attorney, when Corinne Merrick had capacity, every check was signed by Larry Fiscus. Every withdrawal slip was signed by Larry Fiscus. Every deposit slip signed by Larry Fiscus, including the many, many, many withdrawal slips and checks written to cash, which was how he perpetrated his crime. He went to the bank, cashed the checks, and then the money was gone. Money possessed by a vulnerable adult has to be spent on their care and benefit, and on nothing else. That is where the financial exploitation began, and it began long before the physical maltreatment occurred.
In the later stages of dementia, when you might be totally dependent for care, is when we often see neglect. So somebody who can't get their own food or water, somebody who can't get out of bed. As you go through different stages of dementia, you actually can go through a sequence of different types of elder abuse that become more common.
One of the comments that was shared with our investigation by the home health care nurse was related to an inquiry he made about whether or not he could get a hospital bed for her placed in the home. He'd asked if the rails on that bed were the kind of rails that you could tie her down to. And one of the remarks made by the witness was that there was no humor in that remark. Not that it's a funny remark to make anyhow, but she took him at his word. She took him seriously, which is part of what caused her to notify police. And then we responded and found just a horrific scene.
When they got there, they found just absolutely deplorable conditions. She was sitting in her own filth, and she had been there. It was clear that she had been that way for a very long time. She had pressure sores on her body that were not treated, and in fact were impacted with feces and blood, and her condition was very, very dire. And in fact, once she was removed from the home, she died about 2 months later.
I think neglect is one of the least understood forms of elder abuse that occurs. And that's when an older adult isn't provided with what they need in order to have just a reasonable life going on. So people who are neglected are often found in very filthy circumstances, sometimes end up with horrendous wounds, malnourished, dehydrated, etc.
In this case, there was a very gradual decline in Corinne's physical well-being, and these were observed by his close friends because he had friends. And these people knew Corinne and gave me great statements about how much Larry loved her and how much he cared for her. And yet the evidence from an objective point of view was that he didn't provide effective cares for her. He didn't clean her. He didn't see that her hair was washed or that she moved around in her bed when she was no longer ambulatory. Those are not the actions of someone who is capable of providing care for a vulnerable adult, or for that matter, when a person had the kind of money that she did, to have arranged for care that money could have paid for.
Larry Fiscus was charged with neglect of a vulnerable adult.
And then as a result of the financial exploitation case, he was charged with 7 counts of felony financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult.
Mr. Fiscus passed away about 2 weeks after his omnibus hearing, so we were not able to see the case through to a final conviction.
neighbors, family members, our society as a whole has a responsibility to our aging society. And as soon as we all recognize that as we grow older, we might need a little bit more help, but we still deserve all the dignity and respect and kindness and love that everybody in our society should be afforded, we can start having attitudes that say, it is not acceptable for you to be stealing from your mother. It is not acceptable to hit an older adult, even if they struck out at you. It is not acceptable to allow somebody to die under circumstances where they're covered in feces, have a pressure sore, are malnourished because they're old and they were going to die soon anyway. We need to have a society that will not tolerate that type of behavior.
Financial exploitation, actually elder abuse and neglect as well, don't know boundaries. These are tragedies in almost any kind of family.
I guess I would ask the public to be more bold in their protection of the vulnerable adults that live in their community or the people that they're related to and that they love and know. It's that boldness that will help police and the adult protection system get involved early enough to help and to support those who need it most.
The first thing I would tell an abused woman, don't believe him. Get out while you're alive, because they'll threaten. They'll threaten, they'll use every word they can think of. They'll verbally abuse you, physically abuse you, and mentally abuse you.
Don't be afraid to step in and help somebody. If it's an elderly person across the street, if it's calling in a concern that something just isn't right, don't be afraid to act. Do something, because it's happening more often than most people think.
And we need to work together with our politicians, the criminal justice system, the healthcare system, the social service system to say, this is so important. We're going to fund you and we're going to help you make sure that older adults are not suffering abuse and neglect anymore.
Elder Victims, Abused, Exploited, Alone is a Minnesota Partnership co-production with the Minnesota Safe Elders Initiative and Twin Cities Public Television.